The earth groaned as the spade bit into it, a low guttural complaint against the violation. Elias Hale, all of 19 years and built of little more than sinew and stubbornness, put his weight onto the worn wooden handle, feeling the familiar shudder travel up his arms as the blade sliced through a web of stubborn roots. A thin, cold autumn sun offered little warmth, casting long skeletal shadows from the skeletal arms of the surrounding birch trees. He worked inside the footprint of his cabin, a space he had cleared by prying up the rough-hewn floorboards his father had laid a generation ago. Beside the growing pile of dark, loamy earth, a dog lay with his heavy head on his paws, watching every movement with eyes the color of burnt caramel. The dog, Boro, was a creature of immense patience, a shaggy black mountain of an animal who had been Elias's only constant companion since the fever took his parents the winter before. Elias levered the spadeful of dirt, heavy with damp and clay, and tossed it onto the mound. The work was slow, rhythmic, a meditation in sweat and strain. He was not merely digging a hole. He was excavating the heart of his home, chasing an idea scribbled in his father's fading ink across the brittle pages of a leather-bound journal. The plan was an absurdity to anyone but him. A cellar dug not beside the cabin, but directly into its foundation, a cavern of cold stone and earth that would live and breathe with the structure above it. Boro shifted, his tail thumping a soft, two-beat rhythm against the packed dirt. He did not understand the geometry or the physics, but he understood the certainty in the boy's movements. The sound of approaching footsteps, heavy and deliberate, made Elias pause mid-swing. He looked up, shielding his eyes against the pale light. Gable, their nearest neighbor from a half-mile down the track, stood at the edge of the clearing, his hands on his hips, and a deep frown etched into the weathered landscape of his face. He was a man who measured the world in cords of wood and bushels of corn, a man whose knowledge was hard-won and resistant to novelty. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Gable's voice was a gravelly rumble, carrying the weight of 40 winters spent on this land. Elias straightened, wiping a smear of dirt from his brow with the back of his wrist. He nodded a greeting. "Mr. Gable." "Don't you Mr. Gable me," the older man said, stepping closer to peer into the hole. It was already 5 feet deep, a precise rectangle of exposed earth. "You've torn up your floor. Are you planning to live in a pit all winter?" "I'm building a cellar," Elias said. His voice was quiet, a stark contrast to the vastness of the wilderness around them. Gable let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A cellar? I've got a cellar, boy. Everyone's got a cellar. We dig them over there," he gestured, with a thick thumb toward a patch of ground away from his own cabin. "Where the frost heaves won't crack your foundation, and the damp won't rot you out of your own home. What is this foolishness?" Elias looked from the hole to the pages he had memorized in his father's journal. The diagrams were clear, the notes precise, observations of thermal mass and airflow that his father, a man more of books than of axes, had spent years perfecting on paper. "It's a different kind of cellar." "It's a different kind of stupid is what it is," Gable said, his tone softening slightly from accusation to a sort of frustrated pity. "Listen to me, Elias. Your father was a good man, but he had ideas. Not all of them were meant for this world. You dig that hole any deeper, and you'll hit the water table. Come spring thaw, you'll have a pond in your living room. Best case, the winter freeze gets into it, and the ground swells up and pushes your whole cabin off its moorings. I've seen it happen." Elias picked up his spade. The metal was cool against his calloused palms. "I have a plan." "A plan?" Gable scoffed, shaking his head. "The ground has its own plans, boy. So does the winter. They don't care much for what's written in a book. You fill that hole in before you ruin the only thing your father left you." He waited for a response, a sign of acquiescence. When none came, he sighed, a plume of white vapor in the cold air. "Don't say I didn't warn you." He turned and walked away, his heavy boots crunching on the fallen leaves. Elias watched him go, then looked down at Boro. The dog lifted his head and gave a soft whine, a quiet question. Elias reached down and scratched the thick fur behind his ears. "It'll work," he whispered, as much to the dog as to himself. He drove the spade back into the earth, and the rhythmic sound of digging resumed, the only sound in a world that was already holding its breath for winter. That night, by the flickering light of a tallow lamp, he sat at the small wooden table, his father's journal open before him. The ink was brown with age, the handwriting a familiar, elegant script. "The earth below the frost line maintains a constant temperature," his father had written. "Approximately 55 degrees. A traditional cellar, isolated from the house, fights the winter alone. But what if the house and the cellar could share their warmth? What if the hearth, the very heart of the home, could breathe its life into the earth below?" On the opposite page was a complex drawing, a cutaway of the cabin showing a deep, stone-lined cellar. A narrow, brick-lined duct ran from the base of the stone fireplace, snaking down through the foundation and opening into the cellar near its floor. Another vent, higher up on the opposite wall of the cellar, led to a small shielded chimney on the roof. The theory was simple, beautiful, and utterly untested. Convection. The cold, dense air in the cellar would be drawn up the chimney, creating a slight vacuum that would pull warm air from the living space. Air scented with wood smoke and life, down through the hearth duct to replace it. A slow, constant, circular breath. Elias traced the lines of the drawing with a dirt-caked finger. Mr. Gable was a good man. He was right about the frost heaves, about the damp, but he didn't know about the 3-foot-thick stone walls Elias planned to build, the gravel drainage trench, the insulated triple-layered hatch. He didn't know about the careful calculus of airflow and thermal exchange his father had spent a decade refining on paper. Elias felt a familiar ache, the hollow space his parents' absence had left. This wasn't just about surviving the winter. It was about proving his father right. It was about building the one thing the man had never had the time or the strength to build himself. He closed the journal, the worn leather cool beneath his hand. Outside, the wind picked up, a low moan through the pines. It was the first breath of winter. And he had so much more digging to do. The work consumed him. Dawn broke each day to the sight of Elias, stripped to his undershirt despite the deepening chill, rhythmically swinging a pickaxe to break up the rock-laced clay 10 feet below the surface. He worked until dusk, his muscles screaming in protest, his body fueled by dried meat and a grim determination. Boro would lie at the edge of the pit, a silent, furry sentinel, occasionally letting out a low growl when a squirrel chattered too aggressively from a nearby branch. The pile of excavated earth grew into a small mountain beside the cabin, a testament to the sheer volume of his labor. He finished the digging in 2 weeks, a perfect rectangle 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 10 feet deep. The bottom was hard-packed gravel, sloping gently toward a sump he dug in the corner, a precaution against the flooding Mr. Gable had promised. Then came the stones. For another 3 weeks, he hauled fieldstone from the creek bed a quarter-mile away, using a crude wooden sledge his father had built. Each trip was a slow, torturous journey, the sledge runners groaning over the uneven ground, the weight of the stone trying to pull him backward down the slope. His hands already calloused, split, and bled. He would clean them at night with cold water and salt, hissing through his teeth, before wrapping them in clean rags. He ate, slept, and hauled stone. The world shrank to the weight on his back and the next step in front of him. Mrs. Gable came by one afternoon, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She was a kind woman, her face a roadmap of worries, most of them for other people. "Elias," she said, her voice gentle, "you're working yourself to bone." "Ma'am," he acknowledged, not stopping, as he guided another heavy stone down a ramp into the pit. "I brought you some stew and a loaf of bread." She set the basket down, well away from the dust. "Arthur, Mr. Gable, he's just worried for you. We all are. It's not natural, tearing up your own home like this. Winter is almost here." "I'll be ready," Elias said, his voice strained with effort. "But what if Arthur is right?" she pressed, twisting her hands in her apron. "What if it all comes down? Where will you go?" "It won't come down," he said. It was not a boast, but a simple statement of fact. He had measured every angle, memorized every stress point in his father's diagrams. She sighed, her worry undiminished. "Please, eat the stew while it's warm." He did, sitting on the edge of the pit with Boro at his feet, the savory warmth a welcome comfort. He could feel Mrs. Gable's eyes on him, full of a pity he did not want. He finished quickly, thanked her, and went back to his stones. The walls rose slowly, a mosaic of gray and brown stone fitted together with a skill he didn't know he possessed. He was not a mason, but he had his father's eye for how things fit, for the logic of shape and weight. He mixed the mortar in a wooden trough, a precise recipe of sand, lime, and water from the journal, and laid each stone with painstaking care. The walls were 3 feet thick, a massive barrier of thermal mass. As he worked, he built in the ducts his father had designed, carefully lining the passages with smooth, flat stones and packing the joints with clay. The hearth duct was the most difficult, requiring him to carefully dismantle the base of the great stone fireplace, integrate the ductwork, and rebuild it so that it appeared untouched. It was a surgeon's work, and it took him 4 days. Clara Gable, Mr. Gable's daughter, began to appear in the afternoons, sometimes with her mother, sometimes alone. She was quiet like Elias, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Unlike her parents, she never offered advice or warnings. She would simply stand and watch, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. One day she brought a bucket of fresh water from their well. "Your back must hurt," she said. It was an observation, not a question. Elias paused, rubbing the small of his back. It was a solid knot of fire. He nodded. "It does." "My father says you're trying to heat the whole outdoors with your fireplace," she said, her tone neutral. "The heat isn't for the outdoors," Elias replied, gesturing toward the duct he was mortaring into the wall. "It's for the earth." She looked at the duct, then back at the hole, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She didn't mock. She didn't question. She just nodded slowly. "I see." From then on, she came more often, sometimes just to sit with Boro while Elias worked, a quiet presence that he found he did not mind. The day he finished the walls, a cold front moved in. The air grew sharp and thin, and the sky took on the hard, pale cast of impending snow. He had one final, crucial task: the ceiling. He used thick, hand-hewn beams he'd salvaged from a collapsed barn on the Sterling property, paying for them with a week's labor promised for the spring. Mr. Sterling, the wealthiest man in the valley, had laughed when Elias told him what the beams were for. "Building your own tomb, Hale?" he'd boomed, his voice full of casual cruelty. "Make sure you leave room for the dog." Elias had said nothing. He just loaded the beams and left. He wrestled the massive timbers into place by himself, using a system of levers and ramps. It was dangerous, exhausting work. A single slip could mean being crushed. Boro seemed to sense the danger, whining nervously as Elias strained and sweated, maneuvering the last 12-foot beam into its final resting place. When it settled into its notches with a solid, definitive thud, Elias sagged against the stone wall, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He laid thick planking over the beams, leaving a single, square opening for the hatch. He caulked every seam with a mixture of pitch and sawdust, then covered the entire ceiling with a thick layer of sod and earth, insulating it from the cabin floor above. The hatch itself was his final masterpiece. 3 layers of solid oak, with sheep's wool insulation packed between them, fitted so precisely into its frame that it made a soft whoosh of escaping air when he closed it. He stood inside his creation, the lamp casting a warm golden glow on the stone walls. The air was still and cool, smelling of damp earth, mortar, and pine. It felt solid, ancient, like a place that had always been there. He climbed the sturdy ladder he had built, Boro following close behind, and lowered the heavy hatch into place. He stood in the main room of his cabin, the floorboards now relayed and solid beneath his feet. All evidence of the weeks of violent upheaval was gone, save for a single iron ring set flush with the floor. That night, the first snow fell. It came silently, without wind, thick white flakes drifting down to blanket the world in a pristine shroud of white. Elias lit a fire in the hearth, a larger one than usual. He sat before it, watching the flames, feeling the familiar warmth on his face. Boro lay beside him, his head on Elias's lap. After an hour, Elias rose, took a thermometer from the mantelpiece, and lifted the iron ring. He opened the heavy hatch. A draft of cool, but not cold, air wafted up. He lowered the thermometer on a string, letting it hang in the center of the dark space for a full 5 minutes. He could hear the fire crackling in the hearth, a low, steady roar. He pulled the string up. He held the thermometer to the lamplight. Outside, the temperature was dropping past 10 degrees. Inside the cabin, it was a comfortable 68. He squinted at the thin line of mercury. The thermometer from the cellar read 54 degrees, a stable, constant 54 degrees. Boro nudged his hand, and Elias absently stroked his head. "It's working," he said softly. The winter had arrived, and he was ready. He spent the next few weeks stocking his new cellar, sacks of potatoes and flour, barrels of salted pork, bushels of apples, carrots, and onions, all lowered carefully into the cool, still darkness. The space was immense, far larger than he needed for himself. He arranged everything on sturdy wooden shelves he built along one wall, leaving the other side open. Every time he opened the hatch, he was met with the same unchanging air, a stark contrast to the increasingly bitter cold above. The system was breathing. He could feel it, a subtle, almost imperceptible current as he stood on the ladder, the warm air from the cabin being drawn down past him. The valley settled into the deep quiet of winter. The snow piled up, driven by a relentless north wind that scoured the landscape and rattled the window panes of the small, scattered cabins. The talk at the general store, when anyone dared to make the trip, was of the cold. It was a hard winter, the old-timers agreed, the kind that tested a man's preparations. Gable saw Elias at the store one day and grunted a greeting. "How's that hole in your floor treating you?" he asked, a familiar glint of derision in his eye. "It's fine," Elias said, hefting a bag of salt onto his shoulder. "Fine," he says, Gable said to the storekeeper. "Wait until the real freeze comes, the one that goes 6 feet deep. We'll see how fine it is then." The real freeze came in January. The sky cleared and the temperature plummeted. For a week, it never rose above 10 below zero. The snow squeaked underfoot with a dry, alien sound. The trees cracked and popped in the woods, their sap freezing and expanding. It was a beautiful, lethal cold. Smoke rose from the valley's chimneys in thin, straight lines, the only sign of life in a world of white and blue. Elias kept his fire burning hot and steady. His cabin was warm, almost too warm near the hearth. He checked the cellar daily. The temperature never wavered, 54 degrees. His apples were still crisp, his potatoes firm. Nothing was frozen. Nothing was even cold to the touch. One morning, he found a rabbit in one of his snares. He was skinning it outside when he saw Clara making her way through the deep snow toward his cabin. She was bundled in so many layers she was almost round, and her cheeks were bright red with the cold. Boro ran to meet her, his tail wagging furiously. "Good morning," she said, her breath fogging in the air. "Clara," he said, nodding, "it's too cold to be out." "My mother sent me." She was worried. She looked at his cabin, at the steady plume of smoke rising from the chimney. "It looks warm in there." "It is." "Come in." He led her inside, and she unwrapped her scarf, her eyes wide as she felt the heat. "It's warmer than our house," she said, surprised. "My father is burning wood almost as fast as he can chop it, and we can still see our breath in the corners of the room." Elias stoked the fire. "The cellar helps." "He won't admit it," she said quietly, "but he's curious. He keeps asking me if I've seen any cracks in your walls." She paused, looking at the iron ring on the floor. "Can I see it?" Elias nodded. He lifted the hatch. She peered down into the darkness, and he brought a lantern, holding it over the opening. Her gasp was audible. The neat rows of supplies, the dry stone walls, the clean, packed earth floor. It was a hidden sanctuary, a pocket of impossible autumn preserved beneath the frozen house. "It's amazing," she whispered. She looked at him, her eyes shining in the lantern light. "You did it." He just nodded, a quiet pride warming him more than the fire. He had built it. It was real. And it worked. The deep freeze held for another week, and then another. It was no longer just a hard winter. It was becoming a legendary one, the kind that would be spoken of for generations. The wolves grew bold, their howls drawing closer to the cabins at night. The river froze solid, 4 feet thick. The first sign of real trouble came when Mr. Gable appeared at Elias's door late one afternoon. His face was grim, his shoulders slumped with a weight that had nothing to do with the cold. "Elias," he said, his voice rough. He didn't meet the boy's eyes. I need to ask a favor." "Come in," Elias said, stepping aside. Gable entered, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. He stood awkwardly in the center of the warm room, his gaze falling on the iron ring on the floor. "My cellar froze," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The north wall. The frost got in. It must have found a weak spot in the stone. Everything is ruined. Every potato, every carrot. A whole winter's worth of food, frozen solid as rock. Elias said nothing. He simply looked at the older man, at the defeat etched into his face. There was no triumph in this moment, only a shared human vulnerability in the face of the overwhelming power of the cold. "My wife, she's trying to thaw some of the potatoes, but they just turned to mush," Gable continued, his voice cracking. "We won't starve. I can hunt, but the winter's not half over. It'll be hard." He finally looked at Elias, his eyes pleading. "I know it's a lot to ask, but could you spare anything? Some potatoes? Just enough to get us through the next few weeks." Elias walked to the hatch and lifted it. The familiar, cool, earthy smell rose to meet them. "Take what you need for the winter," he said simply. Gable stared, dumbfounded. "What?" "I have more than enough." Elias gestured to the laden shelves. "Take barrels, fill them." He lit a second lantern and descended the ladder. Gable followed, his movements slow and hesitant, as if entering a holy place. He stepped onto the cellar floor and looked around, his mouth slightly agape. He ran a hand along the stone wall. It was cool, but not cold. He picked up a potato from an open bin. It was firm and dry. He looked at the intricate ductwork near the fireplace foundation, the clever chimney vent on the far wall. He looked at the sheer, massive thickness of the walls. He finally understood. It wasn't a hole in the ground. It was a machine, a perfectly designed living system that harnessed the warmth of the earth and the fire. He turned to Elias, his face a mixture of awe, shame, and gratitude. "I was a fool," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was an old, stubborn fool. I'm sorry, boy." "My father had a good plan," Elias said. It was the only explanation he ever offered. They worked together in silence, filling 2 large barrels with potatoes, onions, and apples. When they were done, they hauled them up the ladder and out into the snow. As Gable was preparing to leave, dragging his rescued supplies on a small sledge, he paused. "The Sterlings are in a bad way," he said. "Their grand house is so big they can't keep it warm. Their servants have all but left. I hear their children are sick." Elias nodded, his gaze distant, looking out at the endless white. The storm wasn't over. The next day, a finely dressed but shivering man knocked at his door. It was Mr. Sterling's estate manager. His request was not for food, but for shelter. The Sterling family, the man who had mocked Elias for building his own tomb, was asking to stay in his small, one-room cabin. Their pipes had burst, their food was frozen, and their youngest daughter had pneumonia. Their wealth was useless against the relentless, invasive cold. Elias agreed. An hour later, the Sterlings arrived, a miserable, humbled procession through the snow. Mr. Sterling, his face pale and pinched, could not look Elias in the eye. His wife clutched their feverish daughter, wrapped in a dozen blankets. Elias gave them his own bed, closest to the fire. He, Boro, and the Gables, who had returned to help, would sleep on pallets on the floor. His tiny cabin became a sanctuary. The warmth generated by the hearth and held by the cellar's thermal mass was a palpable, life-giving force. Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Sterling, women from opposite ends of the valley's social ladder, worked together, making stews and broths from the cellar's endless bounty. The cabin was crowded and loud, filled with the sounds of coughing and quiet conversation. It was more alive than it had been in years. Elias tended the fire, hauled water, and said little, moving through the chaos with a quiet competence that everyone, from Mr. Sterling to old Mr. Gable, began to rely on. The great storm, as it came to be called, lasted another full week. During that time, 2 other families sought refuge in the small cabin. At night, 17 people slept on the floor of the house that was supposed to have been torn apart by frost heaves. They were kept warm by the fire and the foolish idea of a dead man, brought to life by his quiet, stubborn son. When the temperature finally broke, rising above 0 for the first time in nearly a month, the valley felt like a battlefield after a truce. The families returned to their own homes to assess the damage, which was catastrophic. Livestock had frozen in barns. Entire stores of food were lost. Several outlying cabins had been abandoned altogether, their occupants presumed to have fled or perished. But everyone who had sheltered in Elias's cabin had survived. The Sterling's daughter had recovered. The community, though battered, was intact. In the spring, as the great thaw began and the world turned to mud and slush, a meeting was held at the general store. It was Mr. Gable who stood up to speak. "We were lucky," he said, his voice carrying through the crowded room. "No, that's not right. We weren't lucky. We were saved by Elias Hale." He looked over at Elias, who stood at the back of the room with Boro at his side. "I laughed at him. I told him he was a fool. I was the fool. He had a better way, and I was too blind and stubborn to see it." Mr. Sterling, looking thinner and older, stood as well. "He's right. My money couldn't keep my daughter warm. His father's knowledge did. I think we all have something to learn from that." That spring, Elias did not work alone. A half-dozen men, including Arthur Gable and 2 of Mr. Sterling's hired hands, showed up at his cabin. They did not come to mock. They came to learn. With his father's journal spread on the table, Elias taught them. He explained the principles of thermal mass, of convection, of insulation. He showed them the drawings, explained the careful ratios of the mortar. He wasn't a natural teacher. His words were few and carefully chosen, but his actions were clear. He didn't just tell them how to build it. He went to their homes and helped them dig. That summer, the valley was filled with the sounds of construction. 7 new cellars were dug, all according to the Hale plan. They were communal efforts, with neighbors helping neighbors, hauling stone, mixing mortar, and raising beams. Elias was at the center of it all, a quiet, authoritative figure whose advice was now sought and followed without question. Clara was often there, bringing water and food, her quiet smile a constant source of encouragement. Their friendship, forged in a winter of doubt and vindicated by the crisis, slowly deepened into something more. They spoke little, but they understood each other perfectly. They were married the following autumn, in a simple ceremony in the clearing outside the cabin, with the whole valley in attendance. Years passed. The settlement grew, tamed by the knowledge that it could withstand the worst the winter could throw at it. The Hale cellar became a standard feature in every new home, a mark of sound construction and foresight. The stories of the Great Storm of '78 became the valley's founding legend, and Elias, though he never sought the role, became its patriarch. He and Clara raised 3 children in the small cabin, which they eventually expanded, though the original structure, with its great hearth and the iron ring in the floor, remained its heart. Elias never lost his quiet nature. He remained a man of few words who preferred the company of his dog and the certainty of a well-laid stone to the complexities of conversation. He taught his children how to work with their hands, how to read the weather, and how to respect the wisdom of the earth. He shared his father's journals freely, and copies were made, finding their way to other settlements, carrying the simple, revolutionary idea far beyond the small valley where it was born. One crisp autumn afternoon, when Elias was a man of 60 and his hair was more gray than brown, he sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. Boro, now ancient and slow, lay beside him. The great dog was nearly 16 years old, his muzzle white, his deep brown eyes clouded with age. He had been there for it all, for the first shovelful of dirt, for the mockery, for the vindication, and for the long, quiet years that followed. He rested his heavy head on Elias's knee, and Elias stroked his soft, familiar fur. The dog gave a contented sigh, his breathing slow and shallow. A few hours later, as the stars filled the sky, Boro died peacefully in his sleep, his head still resting in his master's lap. Elias carried the old dog's body to a spot under a tall pine tree overlooking the valley and buried him deep in the earth he had helped to guard. He carved a simple stone himself, Boro, a good and faithful friend. Clara passed a decade later, and Elias lived on, a living monument in a town that revered him. He watched his grandchildren grow, watched the valley change, watched the world move on. He was an old man, his hands gnarled and his back bent from a lifetime of labor, but his eyes were still clear. He could still see the logic of how things fit together. He died in his 87th year, on a cold January night, in his own bed, in the warm cabin his own hands had secured. The fire in the hearth burned low, and the house was quiet and peaceful. The cellar below, as it had for nearly 70 years, held the cold at bay, breathing its steady, gentle warmth into the home. The entire town turned out for his funeral. They buried him on the small hill beside Clara and his parents, just a few feet from where Boro lay. His son, a master carpenter, carved his headstone. It didn't list his accomplishments or his titles. It was as simple and declarative as the man himself. It read, "Elias Hale, he built on a firm foundation." A century later, the town was still there, a thriving hub in a world of unimaginable change. Many of the old cabins were gone, replaced by newer, more modern homes. But on a small rise overlooking the town, the original Hale cabin still stood. It was a museum now, preserved by the Historical Society. Visitors would walk across the worn floorboards, touch the great stone hearth, and marvel at the simplicity and genius of the design. A guide would lift the heavy iron ring in the floor, and tourists would peer down into the darkness of the cellar that had saved a community. They would hear the story of the quiet, stubborn boy who listened to his father, who ignored the laughter of his neighbors, and who dug a hole in his floor. They would hear how his strange idea, born of ink and paper, had become a legacy of stone and warmth, a testament to the enduring power of a good plan, hard work, and the simple, profound wisdom of the earth. The cabin stood, solid and enduring, a quiet monument against the winter sky.